Welcome again to Joe Stunner Boxing. I'm going to do something a little bit different because although I report on fights and I give you the news and all this sort of thing, it can get a little bit repetitive. I'm not saying it's not something that I enjoy doing. I do enjoy it, and I know you guys enjoy it. But I want to do something a bit different because I know some of you like the historical stuff. And in fact, I'm going to make a video that you could barely call it a boxing video, but it does have relevancy to the Marquess of Queensberry, who, of course, lent his name. This is the Ninth Marquess of Queensberry. He lent his name to the rules of boxing, although he didn't write them. I did a video about this previously. In fact, they were written by a guy called John Graham Chambers, with input from others, I think. But the Marquess of Queensberry, because he was a Marquess and he had a certain standing in the very much the class-driven Victorian era, he lent his patronage, if you like, to the rules and kind of helped legitimise them. But there was a big event, if you like, a big, very interesting human interest story, rather fascinating story that is very, very famous amongst people of a literary ilk, because John Sholto Douglas, which was the real name of the Marquess of Queensberry, the Ninth Marquess of Queensberry, he had a hugely vindictive, nasty, drawn-out battle with the great poet and writer Oscar Wilde, the Irish poet and writer Oscar Wilde, who, and the basis of this was that Wilde was having an affair with the Marquess of Queensberry's son, Lord Alfred Douglas, who went by the name of Bosie. That was his nickname, Bosie. Now, I'll go into this. Let's talk about Marquess of Queensberry to start with. Like I say, his name was John Sholto Douglas. He was born on 20th of July, 1844, and he died 31st of January, 1900, which oddly enough was the same year that Oscar Wilde died. So both of these guys who really did bang heads, and I'll go into that in detail in a minute, they both died the same year, although he was older than Wilde by, was he born 44? So I think he was about 10 years older than Wilde, roughly. Now, he was born, John Sholto Douglas, the Marquess of Queensberry. He was born in Florence in Italy, which is a beautiful city. If you've never been there, go there because it's absolutely stunning, brilliant city. He actually had Scottish roots. He was, as a young man, he was in the Navy. He served in the Navy. He also went to, I want to say, Cambridge rather than Oxford. But he didn't do a degree there. He was more interested in sport. He wasn't interested and he wasn't very good in academia. But he did like playing sport. And he played cricket, running, steeplechasing. I think he hunted a bit as well. He liked his guns. He was a tough, rough and tumble sort of guy. And at 22, he got married. He had 4 sons and a daughter, I think. He was extremely abusive to all his children and to his wife. Eventually, she divorced him 20 years later, roughly 22, 23 years later. And also the abuse that he inflicted on his wife led to, or certainly it's generally thought contributed to the hatred that his second son, Lord Alfred Douglas, had towards him. And we know this because of letters that were exchanged between the two. His oldest son, who was rumoured to be homosexual, was also rumoured to have killed himself. So he died of a gunshot wound. And it was generally thought that because the guy was gay and he was having an affair with someone, I don't know who the fuck he was having an affair with, but some relatively esteemed other man, it may have come out in a scandal. Of course, the Marquess of Queensberry wouldn't have been very pleased about this, being the tough macho guy that he was. And the guy, it is thought that John Sholto Douglas's oldest son may have killed himself, may have shot himself. That was another reason for his second son, Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, to hate him. And again, we know this from letters that were sent to, really heavy-duty insults being thrown around. And don't forget, this is Victorian times. Threats of killing each other. And at one point, I know Bosie sent a letter to his father saying, if you come anywhere near me, I've bought a pistol and I'll use it, I'll blow your head off. This is a son talking to his father. So there was real enmity there, real enmity. By the way, the oldest son was called Francis. And it's come to be that the gay relationship that it was rumoured Francis was in was with none other than Earl of Rosebery, who at the time was the Liberal Prime Minister. So yes, of course, had that come out, that would have been a very, very scandalous, very, very scandalous. And he killed himself. Well, he's rumoured to have killed himself anyway. Now, that's the Marquess of Queensberry, John Sholto Douglas. Let's talk a bit about Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was a brilliant playwright. He was born 16th of October in 1854 in Dublin, Ireland. His mother had the nickname Speranza. She was a vehement Irish nationalist, extremely strong-willed, very, very mentally tough woman, which for the time was considered, very, very unusual. She was very much a raging feminist, tough, very, very tough woman, a proper feminist, not one of these, third, fourth generation ones, whatever we're on now, that very often talk a lot of crap. This was someone who really did fight for women, fought for women's rights. And she brought his father actually was a surgeon. I can't remember whether he was an ear surgeon, eye surgeon or an ear surgeon. But clearly, a very, very well-to-do professional family from Ireland. And Wilde was a very big man. He grew up to be, he was about 6'4". He filled out as an adult. He was a big guy, a big guy. But he went to Trinity College, Dublin, and then Magdalen College in Oxford. And he had some of his, I can't remember whether they were his tutors or whether they were his contemporaries. Wouldn't be his contemporaries, would they? But he rubbed shoulders with some very, very highly thought of literary giants and people from other disciplines such as philosophy. People like John Ruskin, who was an artist. Wilde was very into art. Walter Pater. I think they were two of his tutors. Pater was a literary, very, very highly thought of literary man. And this was at the time of the emerging philosophy of aestheticism. So, the beauty of things, they talk a lot about literature, the arts, paintings, trying to find the beauty in it, trying to learn lessons from, trying to take what you saw in beautiful art and apply it to real life. And as a result, Wilde emerged as someone who was very much at the forefront of this movement. I've always thought of him as being kind of a dandified punk rocker, very much prodded and poked the morals of the time. Used to make what were then considered outrageous statements, very, very witty, very, very funny, and very, very true, because a lot of the time what he would say would shock people, but at the same time, because it was true and because it was funny, he would get away with it. Okay, for years he didn't struggle in obscurity because he was far too flamboyant. He'd wear all sorts of dandified clothes. Never without a quip to make about something. But for many years, he couldn't really find his sort of niche, if you like. And he wrote poetry, but his poetry books didn't sell particularly well. He edited a couple of magazines, and his career didn't really seem to be going anywhere. He was kind of, at the time, for many years, it was almost like he was famous for being famous. I'm trying to think of an equivalent in today's world. Someone who is very, very charismatic and, probably has some talent, but, you sort of say, well, why are they famous? He was kind of like, his art was very sort of niche and very left field, but at the same time, because he was who he was, and he was so noticeable, and he was such great entertainment to be around, kind of like the person that crops up on talk shows and everyone watches it and really thinks they're a funny, absorbing, charismatic person. But then you think, by the way, why are they on the talk show? What are they famous for? He was kind of like that sort of character for years, for many, many years, even though he clearly had a great deal of talent, but he couldn't hone that talent. And then eventually he really got it together. And he started to write plays, okay? And his plays were, well, An Ideal Husband was one. He had a play that was a flop called Salome, which was about John the Baptist. But the one that really broke him, if you like, to use the modern day parlance, was a play called The Importance of Being Earnest. Now, he also wrote a novel. He only ever wrote one novel. He wrote lots of short stories, but only one novel. And that was a very controversial book called The Picture of Dorian Gray, which dealt with all sorts of, I guess you would call it, scandalous, immorality. People. It was about living a very immoral or even amoral, perhaps, life. Murder. The subject of murder was broached. Prostitution. It wasn't. It was a moral tale, basically, but it definitely delved into the underbelly of Victorian life, which no one ever used to even mention. In other words, it mentioned a lot of taboo subjects. Okay, and this book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, it sold, but it was considered to be a scandalous piece of work, as were a lot of Wilde's more adult poems. He also wrote children's books as well. Because he married a lady by the name of Constance Wilde, and had two children, Cyril and Vivian, and with the plays that sort of shot him to fame, especially The Importance of Being Earnest, he became a massive star, if you like, a modern day star, someone that everyone wanted to meet, everyone wanted to hang out with. Wherever he went, he was noticed. He always had a table in a restaurant, as they say, no problem. But he had one thing that was holding him back, or a skeleton in his closet, shall we say. And that was that even though he was married with two kids, essentially he was gay. And his friend, very, very good, loyal friend of his, Robert Ross, who knew Wilde for many, many years and supported him until he died, was a good friend until he died. He was also gay. And he was instrumental in Wilde kind of coming out of the closet, as they say, and embracing the idea that he was actually gay. Even though he did love his wife, and he always treated his wife very well, and he loved his kids, but he wrote the children's stories that he published were ones that he had written for his two sons when they were little. One of his sons would go on, by the way, to be killed in the First World War. The other one would live to be an old age. I actually met one of his grandsons, one of Wilde's grandsons, at a play. I went to an Oscar Wilde play about Oscar Wilde's life, 15 years ago in London, and I couldn't believe it because I recognised the guy and I was like, "Are you Oscar Wilde's grandson?" I can't remember his name. Yeah, he said, "Yeah, I am," and it's amazing. I've met some boxing stars in my time, but that would be like meeting, Muhammad Ali or someone. Anyway, that's Oscar Wilde. Okay, so he was at the height of his powers. He was the governor. This was late Victorian era, late 19th century. Now, the fact that he was gay and he began to explore his gay proclivities, shall we say, meant that being gay then would get you thrown in prison. It was illegal. And so he was taking risks. He could potentially lose everything, all his fame, all his wealth. His wife would leave him. He'd lose his kids and everything. And then he met Lord Alfred Douglas, who was the second son of the Marquess of Queensberry. And Lord Alfred Douglas was a lot younger than Wilde. I think he was in his early 20s when he met Wilde. And he was, I think he was he at Oxford or Cambridge? He was one of the two big ones, the two big universities. And Wilde read a poem that he wrote called "The Spirit Lamp," which was published. I think it was Oxford. It was in Oxford or Cambridge. There was an undergraduate journal which he edited called "The Spirit Lamp," and one of his poems the poem wasn't called "The Spirit Lamp." The magazine was called "The Spirit Lamp," and Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, published some of his works in this publication. And Wilde apparently read these and was introduced to Bosie and just fell for him, because he was a young, rather slight guy, very feminine, very effete, good-looking boy, and Wilde, a big, strong fella. Even though he was 20 years older than him, he fell for him totally and became quite obsessed with him in a very, very toxic, negative way. Now, Lord Alfred Douglas may have detested his father, but he had his temper and he had his mental instability, because the Marquess of Queensberry was disliked amongst polite circles, really disliked, because he was a thug. He would go around starting fights. He was always drunk. He was always involved in sort of fracas that got him arrested. Of course, he'd get away. He'd just pay the fine and then piss off because he was minted. And Lord Alfred Douglas, although he didn't have his father's toughness, physical toughness, he certainly had his temper, and he was certainly he had that nasty, vindictive streak. And the relationship between him and Wilde was, fraught with all sorts of stresses and anxieties for Wilde, because one minute Douglas would be really nice, the next minute he'd be calling Wilde the most unpleasant things, saying he didn't want to see him again, and then But it got to the point where he was leeching off Wilde. He was a total parasite. And in one particular year, now get a load of this, we're talking about the mid-1890s, Lord Alfred Douglas, of Wilde's money, racked up a bill for restaurants, places to stay, and so on and so everything, gifts, for 1,500 quid in 1892, something like that, 1893. 1,500 quid back then. Do you know what that was? That would be tens of thousands now. And he was just spending Wilde's money. And then when at the moment Wilde tried to put his foot down, Douglas would throw a strop, throw his toys out the pram. So it was that type of relationship. But nevertheless, the Marquess of Queensberry, having lost his oldest son, and with the Rosebery potential scandal that could have come out, where his oldest son was allegedly having an affair with Lord Rosebery, the last thing he wanted was for his second son to be involved in a similar scandal with the biggest celebrity stroke star in Britain, which was Wilde. So he hated Wilde. He hated Wilde with a passion. He didn't like his son. His son certainly didn't like him. But he went after Wilde. And there was a famous, I don't know whether it's ever been confirmed, but there was it's more of a legendary thing. It probably did happen, but not quite as, it's been exaggerated. It's been embellished, I think. And that is that on one occasion, he came round Wilde's house in Chelsea. Wilde had a house in Tite Street in Chelsea. And Douglas, the Marquess of Queensberry turned up with one of his pugilists, his bare-knuckle boxer mates. And they forced their way into Wilde's house because the butler or the maid answered the door, and they just pushed past him or her, pushed their way into Wilde's study and demanded, the Marquess of Queensberry demanded that Wilde stop seeing his son. Well, Wilde, as I said, was about 6'4", and he didn't take too kindly to people barging into his house unannounced. So he stood up. He slapped the boxer around, who may have been a bit handy, but like I say, at 6'4" and probably weighed about 250, Wilde was a very, very big man for that particular era. And then he physically threw the Marquess of Queensberry out of his house, threw him out, and said, "Don't come back, don't ever come back, otherwise you get more of the same." Well, of course, the Marquess of Queensberry, John Sholto Douglas, he was not going to roll over. He was like, no, I'm coming after you. So he turned up at one of Wilde's plays, at the premiere of one of Wilde's plays, which was a roaring success. Wilde took a curtain call, and there was flowers being thrown and all that sort of jazz. And he left a calling card, the Marquess of Queensberry did. He left a calling card at the desk for it to be given to Oscar Wilde. And at the end of the night, when everyone was going home, Oscar was called over to the front desk, and the guy said, "The Marquess of Queensberry left you this card." And it said on it, "To Oscar Wilde," and he meant to write "posing as a sodomite," which was a really serious accusation, because again, it was illegal. Homosexuality was absolutely illegal. But he misspelled sodomite, spelled it somdomite, because he's a fucking idiot. Even though he's been to fucking Cambridge, he couldn't even spell sodomite. And Wilde was pissed off at this. He said, this guy's getting out of hand now. He also, prior to that, just as a little amusing anecdote, he turned up at another one of Wilde's plays with a bouquet of rotting vegetables and presented them to Wilde, because they were all presenting with proper bouquets. All his fans were. He said, "Here, Oscar, this is what you're worth," and he gave him this bouquet of smelly vegetables. And Oscar said, "Thank you so much, Marcus. Every time I smell them, I shall think of you." That was a kind of witticism that he had. He would, and everyone, of course, hearing this, just laughed at John Sholto Douglas, who was pissed off because he was being laughed at, and then he sodded off. But this calling card went beyond that. This was a real insult. And Wilde showed the card to the Marquess of Queensberry's son, Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas. He said, "Look at this fucking thing." And Douglas said, "That's slander. He can go to prison. This is our chance. We can get my father in prison. Get him in prison." So every one of Wilde's friends said, "Don't go there. Don't go there. Don't take this. It'll come out that you and Bosie and all your little mates are actually gay. And you know what'll happen then? You'll be the ones in the dock." But Bosie was like, "Nah, you lot have got no guts. Oscar, you need to sue my father," because he hated his father. Sue him. So Oscar went through with it, and he tried to sue the Marquess of Queensberry for slander. And the Marquess of Queensberry, if he was found guilty, would have gone to prison. And that would have been it. He'd have been out of their hair, them being Oscar and Bosie. But unfortunately, the Marquess of Queensberry, a man of money, hired the best lawyers, and they unearthed a string of rent boys that had something to do with Wilde, Bosie, and some of their mates. And it became apparent that the tide was turning against Wilde. And the first trial against John Sholto Douglas, I think it was a hung jury. They couldn't make it. So they had a second trial. And John Sholto Douglas was found innocent of slander. And the amount of evidence that had come out that Wilde had been liaising with rent boys. I say rent boys, they weren't children. They were like late teens, early 20s. he wasn't a paedophile. He was, but he was more of a Prince Andrew than a fucking, I don't know, Jimmy Savile. But yeah, it was so obvious, there was too much evidence. So after the second trial, the police actually came and arrested Wilde and tried him for well, I can't remember the technical term for it, for homosexuality, obscene behaviour, whatever it was called back in the day. Now, Wilde was found guilty, and his name was reduced to, he became a total social pariah. His name was reduced to being either a joke or something that everyone found repulsive. And he was bankrupted because all of his belongings were sold. He couldn't get any work anywhere. He was potless. His wife left him, took the kids, and he was reduced to nothing, to absolutely nothing. And the Wilde, there were two trials. I think the first one, it was a hung jury. Again, was there a hung jury for the, I think I made a mistake earlier. I think it was the slander trial was just one trial, and there were two trials for Oscar Wilde, and the first one was a hung jury. And then the second one, I'm doing this from memory, but the second one, he was found guilty, and he was sent to Reading Jail for 2 years. And Reading Jail, this is hard labour. And Oscar Wilde, a man of letters, even though he's a big strapping fella, he's not used to holding anything more than a fucking pen, a quill. But those trials were intriguing because they basically, prior to the Oscar Wilde trials, if you saw a man who was very sort of flamboyant and what we would now consider effeminate, you wouldn't think of someone being gay or homosexual or anything like that. You would say that is a dandy. That is a very sort of an upper class gentleman. All right. But because Wilde was found guilty of homosexuality, of committing obscene acts, some of those guys were under 21 as well. They were on 19, 20, which means that was the age of consent back then. Never mind the fact that they were gay, which was illegal anyway. But because of those trials, we now think of anybody who is very flamboyant and dresses, colourfully or whatever, has a fancy hairdo, as being gay or effeminate. The trials had that effect on society. On the way that people perceived that image, if you like. And Wilde became, like I say, the absolute, he was persona non grata throughout the whole of society. And all his friends who had basked in his glory and dined out on his name and his money, they all fucked off and left him. And in fact, Wilde became he moved to Paris. He lived in Paris because he just couldn't live in England, in London anymore. And he died in Paris in 1900, 30th of November. So that would have been 10 months after the Marquess of Queensberry died. And that, in a nutshell, and that is just off the top of my memory overview, is the story of the battle between the Ninth Marquess of Queensberry, John Sholto Douglas, and Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. Wilde died of, I can't remember what it was. Was it pneumonia? I can't remember. I know that Douglas died of what they thought was syphilis, because he was complete adulterer throughout his whole marriage. He actually married a second time, Marquess of Queensberry did, and the marriage was annulled within less than a year, a few months, because his wife couldn't put up with all the other women. She was like, fuck this, so she kicked him out. And he was a horrendous person, an absolutely fucking horrendous person. And whatever you think of Wilde, I think he died of meningitis, actually, Wilde did. And there's that famous quote. He's he's about to die. He's laying in bed, and in the cheapest of hotels. I mean, horrible hotel. And he looks up and he says, "Either that wallpaper has got to go, or I'm going to go," because it was such a horrendous. Wilde, who'd grown up and prided himself in having everything beautiful around him, that aesthetic movement thing. He was in the cheapest dive of a hotel with shit wallpaper, and he said, "Either take that wallpaper's going, or I am." Well, he went. Yeah. So that's the story, but about the Marquess of Queensberry and Oscar Wilde. A very sad story, really. A great human interest story. There is a biography on Wilde by a guy called Richard Ellman, which goes into this far better than I've just done. A great book. Great, one of my favourite. I love biographies, and that is probably my favourite biography that I've ever read. I read it like 30 years ago, whatever, and I've still got that copy. It's one of the great books I will never ever part with. And Wilde's work has, it is very much of the era. It's a Victorian era. His plays are, drawing room dramas, but they're very funny. They are there's lots of, amusing bits and pieces in them, lots of witticisms, and a lot of Wilde's sayings, if you like, or bon mots, or epigrams. I mean, some of them have actually, come into regular use in everyday life. Some of his most famous quotes: "We're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking up at the stars." I like that one in particular. "Be yourself. Everyone else is taken." That's another of my favourites. Whenever everyone agrees with me, I always presume I'm wrong. I like that one as well, a lot. That's how I've always felt. But yeah, Oscar Wilde definitely kicked against the morals of the time. He was no angel, of course, but then compare him to the thuggery of John Sholto Douglas, and I'll take Wilde any day of the week. But there you go. The Marquess of Queensberry, the Ninth Marquess of Queensberry versus Oscar Wilde. That's the story of it. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a long one. It was over half an hour now. I know it wasn't a boxing video, but I just thought I wanted to do something different, and I hope you did enjoy it. And if you did enjoy it, hit the like button. And if you really enjoyed it and you're new, subscribe to the channel. Come on. Do you think this little thing I've got on my head makes me look a bit like Oscar Wilde and the old Joe Stunner looks? I'm not that good. I'm certainly not that witty, and I'm certainly not that intelligent. But then few people are. And God knows the Ninth Marquess of Queensberry certainly wasn't. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Enjoy the show. Bye for now.